What's happening in the Northern Ireland economy? And what can we expect from the U-turning Chancellor's budget? Is Trump really lowering tariffs in response to inflationary pressures? And why has China ended up with a tomato paste surplus? Hello and welcome to Trading Up Unpacked. I'm Jim Fitzpatrick.
And I'm Richard Ramsey.
And this is the business podcast from the Irish News, produced in association with EY, where myself and the Professor of Practice from Queen's Business School dig deep into the big business issues of the day. And remember, you can get in touch at any time with us on email at tradinguppodcast@gmail.com. And actually, Richard, before we get into it, I just want to, I don't know if you were driving in and parked on the street today, but I have a rant to start with, okay? So, coming up to Christmas, Belfast is busy, I know, but they've just changed the rules on parking and using the parking app. So when you now park on the street and you go into the little app to pay, you have to say how long you're going to be at that point. You're not allowed to sort of come back and pay at the end. You have to pay there and then and estimate how long you're going to be. And then, of course, if you make a mistake or you forget and you come back late, you're going to be stung with massive tickets. And I'm just sort of wondering, is there any other service, maybe, you know, where we pay up front regardless of how much we use and or get fined enormous amounts whenever we misestimate how much we're going to use? You know, can you think of examples?
You've got me there.
I just wonder, you know, why are they allowed to do this? It feels like larceny, and I just wonder whether it's a good economic model when you're trying to encourage economic activity in the city centre.
I suppose it's probably not as bad as last year, whenever there was all the roadworks on the M3 and all the kind of chaos coming up to Christmas and stuff. So
remember that.
Unless there's going to be more roadworks unveiled,
they've plenty of time to do that. I've no doubt we can expect a bit of that as well. But anyway, any thoughts on that one? Let us know. That's just my little rant out of the way. Let's get into the economics. Let's start off locally, I suppose. The Northern Ireland PMI, Purchasing Managers Index, is called something else nowadays as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's called Regional Growth Tracker.
And unfortunately, it's firms are reporting 10th monthly decline in the last 11 months. So just explain to me what is happening then in the Northern Ireland economy, according to this survey.
Yeah, so what this survey is, it would be asking about 200 firms a month what is happening with on a range of economic indicators such as business activity or sales, and whether it's up, down or no change on the previous month. And that's what the October survey was saying, that it was there were more firms reporting a decline than an increase, and then so that's what it is. And net balance is then talking about decline. So that's a more negative survey than what we've seen in the official statistics up until the second quarter. What we are seeing within that's 4 sectors are covered. Manufacturing and services actually returned to growth, albeit it was modest. So the overall decline was driven by construction and retail. And if we look at new orders, which is like a forward-looking indicator, they have private sector firms reported their 12th successive month-on-month decline in new orders, and that's across all 4 sectors. Marked decline in export orders as well. And employment, we're seeing firms are still increasing their headcount month-on-month, but relatively modest levels. But what we are seeing is that inflationary pressures are starting to kick back, come back to the fore, with firms citing increased wage pressures, which kind of isn't a surprise given all the employers' national insurance contributions feeding through national living wage, and then just still ongoing wage pressures.
Yeah. So we've discussed this before. We've seen huge changes at the kind of lower end of things with increase in the minimum wage, an extension across the age groups. We've seen the living wage going up. We've seen a lot of settlements in the public sector as well, which have boosted wages. So that's all good for workers, but things start to then feed through to employers with, as you say, the increased national employers insurance contributions, but interestingly, and this is maybe the conundrum. So if we look at the unemployment rate for Northern Ireland in the labour market, there 2.4% July to September, which is half the rate in the UK, which has now hit 5%. And, the 5% rate there in the UK, was a bit of a headline because it seemed to suggest and, give some weight to the evidence that Rachel Reeves' previous budget, where she increased national employers' insurance contributions, was having a negative effect on employment. But yet, in Northern Ireland, our rate is still half the UK average. So what's happening there? I mean, I suppose, there are other things at play as well.
Yeah, so certainly the impact of Rachel Reeves' budget measures last year, November 24, seems to be, it has been having a bigger impact in the UK. In Northern Ireland, you're seeing a small impact, and we're seeing the likes of the number of jobs in the hospitality sector has been starting to fall back, and but then we've been having significant growth in the public sector, which has kind of been boosting things here. But what you have to remember as well is our labour market has always flattered the unemployment rate, the low unemployment rate, which ministers love to trot out with monotonous regularity, conceals the fact that we have high levels of economically inactive. Those people neither in work or looking for work. So that's long-term sick, students looking after family and the home, or retired. And Northern Ireland's is the highest of anywhere in the UK. So it's about 26.8%, I think the latest figures, 21% of working age economically inactive in the UK. And so that's kind of the problem. And the UK would still view that 21% as being a problem. Mm-hmm. And then if you look at then Northern Ireland, we've got 119,000 people long-term sick, or 1 in 10 of the working age population. So if you're an employer or a business, and where a lot of employers are struggling to get skills and recruit labour straight away of that pool that you're looking to fish from in order to get, there's like 1 in 10 aren't even at the party. They're long-term sick and obviously not up for employment.
Not available for work then. Yeah. And it has been higher here on average, and there are lots of reasons for that. And I think anecdotally, I've heard from the hospitality sector, and you can sort of see it. Some new venues, for instance, people are still putting money into new venues in Belfast and elsewhere, and beautiful venues, nice new bars and restaurants. But the challenge they do have is getting the staff. Yeah. So you'll maybe hear people say, I went out and tried that new place, but the service was awful. It's not that the staff weren't any good, it's just maybe weren't enough of them. Yeah. And I noticed myself heading down south, maybe to a couple of events in recent months, and it struck me, it was sort of like a trip back in time to sort of pre-Brexit days. Heading down to a hotel across the border for a conference, suddenly I was met with staff who had maybe Eastern European accents, things that have sort of disappeared from the hospitality scene here in Northern Ireland, because we had so much focus post-Brexit about the special arrangements for here, the dual market access, the fact that Northern Ireland still remains part of the single market for goods and so on. But it's not part of the single market for labour. And you really see that difference north and south, that there's still a lot of people from the rest of the EU working, in things like hospitality and elsewhere. But here it's gone. And so employers are looking to local people, which is good in one respect, to get people into work. But they're probably finding it a struggle because, as the figures tell us, 1 in 10 of the Northern Ireland's working age population are long-term sick and really aren't available to work for anybody. Yeah,
and increasingly they're the younger generation as well. So we've got a bit of the legacy of COVID, where there's all kind of like anxiety, mental health issues are now really coming to the fore, or have been for a number of years. And so whenever you even look at the so-called NEETs, which are the not in employment, education or training, those people aged 16 to 24. So that's been rising, and the Northern Ireland Skills Council reckons the number of NEETs is going to increase by 2,000 per year. So, and you think of that age group, those are normally when you think of the hospitality sector, the vast majority are within that age group as well. So again, that's when you think of coming in at the bottom, or the start of the kind of employment ladder if people are then coming out in that 16 age group and they're not even getting involved at all, that's going to store up bigger problems further down the line if you don't sort of intervene early to try and mitigate against that.
Yeah, and as you say, it is an issue across the board in the UK because it ties into, I suppose, things like productivity, how the economy is doing in general. Is there a capacity for growth? And it doesn't seem like there is any clear direction from the government as to what they want to do about this, because perhaps a hard-headed thing might be to say, well, we're going to reform benefits. There's a carrot and stick here. Let's try and get people off benefits and into employment. But we know that the Labour government, when it tried to change the benefits, got spooked. Its backbenchers revolted, and it's parked that. And every indication now suggests that that's parked for the medium to longer term. So the benefits bill continues to increase. There's no action on that front. And yet we're not seeing, certainly I'm not hearing about the kind of big initiatives that New Labour had. And of course, New Labour had a lot of money to play with in terms of trying to encourage people back into employment, new employment schemes, a big push. We're not hearing about anything like that either.
Yep, which is concerning. And I ultimately think the kind of U-turn and the fact that Rachel Reeves got spooked on some of the welfare cut reforms, they're going to have to revisit that. And if they don't do it, the next government is going to have to do that, because it's unsustainable. And while the whole focus seems to be then going on the tax side, it was like listening to Andy Haldean earlier today, where he was then talking about there needs to be...
Andy Haldean, just should say, former economist at the Bank of England?
Chief economist, Bank of England. For my money, I reckon he'll could be the next governor of the Bank of England, if you're a betting man.
No, that would be good. I met him once, and I could say that I knew if he does get the position, I know the new governor then,
Yeah. He's one of those ones whenever is working in the bank and you would read speeches of Monetary Policy Committee members. If Andy Haldean had written an article, you would always read it. He's very entertaining.
He's a good communicator,
writer,
yeah. And that's, let's face it, it's a rare thing amongst economists, obviously a gift that you have, but not many do, Richard. So what's Andy Haldean been saying then?
Well, he was then just saying, he was saying a lot of things, but in terms of for the strategy going forward, he was saying that they really need to be then looking at if they're increasing tax, they've got to be looking at public spending as well, because it's not sustainable. And he was then talking about a 1-for-1. If you increase tax by £1, how do you then look at reducing public spending by £1? And he was talking about public sector reform and the fact that productivity for so far this century, public sector productivity has been flat. Mm-hmm. And then he was also then, I suppose, you're maybe coming on to it, but then about sort of bemoaning the what he termed the circus that we've seen on the budget since it was announced on the 6th of September that there was going to be a budget next Wednesday on the 26th, and all the kind of fun and games that we've seen since then. Yeah,
I mean, I mentioned about the U-turning Chancellor, but I'm not sure what happens if somebody U-turns and U-turns and U-turns. That maybe it's no longer a U-turn; it's just some kind of.
We've just been getting dizzy with it.
Yeah, so. Exactly. It's kind of spinning around, and it's very hard for people like us to sound sensible whenever we, have some sort of analysis of what's being said. They talk about pitch rolling, and the Chancellor went out of her way just. Short time ago, a couple of weeks ago, to roll the pitch and prepare everybody for tax rises, and then a week later decided no, that wasn't going to happen. So it is rather bizarre. Actually, I don't think I've ever seen a budget so trailed in different ways and then untrailed and changed day to day
before the budget has even come about.
Yeah,
like we're suffering from budget fatigue here, and we haven't even had the budget yet.
And so let's talk about the budget then. So, a few weeks ago, I remember writing a piece where I said, basically, income tax is the tax that Rachel Reeves needs to raise, but she won't. And she won't because Labour made pre-election manifesto promises where they said they won't tax or increase taxes on working people, whatever that means. and therefore she wasn't likely to raise income tax. But I set forward some of the arguments as to why it was a good tax to raise if you're short of money. It was fairly fair. You can, hit everybody at the same time. Everybody takes a share of the pain, and you get a reasonable return. You get a reasonable amount of money into the coffers to spend. Then I had to eat my words when, she did that speech. She said, I am going to, effectively, she sort of signalled she was going to raise income tax because it was all for the good of the country, not the good of the party. But now we're back to, I think, the good of the party rather than the good of the country. So she's not going to raise income tax, it seems. And that seems now, as we speak at this moment, pretty well what is being flagged up. But let's look at that then, because if she doesn't raise income tax, and she needs to give herself what everybody's talking about, this headroom. She needs to have, because economic forecasts aren't perfect, so she needs to make sure she's got enough money in the bank to do what the government says it needs to do. And if she doesn't raise enough tax, then her headroom is going to be really tight. And if something else happens, then she's going to have to come back and raise more taxes. So she's got to try and raise enough to have that headroom. And if she's not going to go for one of the biggies like income tax, then what we're talking about now, and the phrase they've come up with, is a smorgasbord option.
Yeah, we're brushing up on our Swedish culinary
a Swedish
options.
buffet, I think that's what a smorgasbord, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which sounds nice.
Hot and cold.
We all love a bit of a smorgasbord. We can all go and pick what we like, but it's not quite the same thing when we're talking about a smorgasbord of tax. Because
as opposed to a dog's dinner, I suppose.
I think this sounds a bit more like a dog's dinner. Let's be frank. She's going to attack different little small taxes, and by amalgamating all of those, hopefully get enough money. The reason people like you and other commentators and my own view would be is this isn't a great idea is that, let's face it, what's going to happen is the calculations might say you'll raise this amount of tax, but you're going to have all these unintended consequences, aren't you, from this whole myriad of tax changes. And it's also going to hit very specific interest groups in a way that they'll be very vocally opposed to it. And then perhaps we might see the government having to backtrack on some of these anyway. So, what's your take on it?
Yeah, because, I would have been for breaking the manifesto pledge, going for the income tax raise. It's simpler and spreads the pain, and it's kind of guaranteed that you'll get the money in. There's not, and that was basically she had Rachel Reeves had got the bond markets on side, because then they sort of thought, right, this seems like a sensible idea, and it's going to be shore up the kind of fiscal consolidation, etc. But now, yes, we're going down the smorgasbord route, and as you say, if you start then going for different areas that she's going to hit, where different interest groups, we've seen what's happened with the farmers and in terms of the inheritance tax proposals, and then also in terms of some of the inheritance tax on companies and all of those kind of things. And you start, once you start going down that route, unless you've got everything wired off that you know exactly how people are going to react, it can start then sucking up more political capital as you go along. I think what she's going to do, the kind of areas that she's then going to hit are, they're talking about then the income tax thresholds. So what she had previously said was she was going to unfreeze the tax thresholds, which the previous Conservative government had done. And what that was doing was basically just, you weren't increasing the tax thresholds in line with inflation, which meant as you got a pay rise, more and more people were paying a higher proportion of that extra money on tax.
Yeah, I remember just to sort of explain that again, because yes, it's the point at which that particular tax rate kicks in. And I remember, back to my earlier reporting days, and we'd always, be geared up to look at the budget, and it was pretty much a matter of course, where they'd get to the bit about talking about the tax bands, and they'd say, and I am raising the whatever it is, tax rate, basic rate, or whatever, from whatever in line with inflation to whatever. That was just a given. And then that changed was that during the financial crisis, or whenever the Conservatives were imposing austerity, or was it before that even?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether Gordon Brown ever tinkered with that, but certainly it was part of then austerity and sort of the Osborne sort of era. And I suppose that kind of measure comes under stealth tax, because while people will notice when they hear their tax rates going up, they don't notice the fact that they're paying more tax of the new money that's coming in, because they haven't actually. They don't necessarily kind of see that. So,
and then let's be honest,
it's a bit of a con. It's like hoodwinking the electorate, really.
Yeah, and so you have a promise on the one hand, a pre-election promise, which says, I'm not going to increase taxes on working people, so you don't put up income tax. But if you allow more people to be dragged into the basic or the higher rate of tax, you are putting up their taxes. And so therefore you can claim, well, I haven't put up the taxes, but you have, by not raising the threshold, because you've ignored the impact of inflation. And, so anyway, that is...
And where I think she could go a step further here is, instead of like freezing, there could be actually the kind of the limbo dancing with the thresholds, where she actually brings them down.
Right.
And that's what there's been talk of. So, if you take even the likes of the additional rate income tax, the 45 pence, which is at £125,140, if that was lowered, or equally if the higher rate, which is where you pay 40%, which is on incomes over 50,270, if that was like lowered, you could lower that slightly, but again, you're getting, that is a big. She'll get a lot of revenue boost from doing that, where it doesn't breach her manifesto pledges if you're looking at the semantics of increasing the rates, but the kind of spirit of it is the manifesto pledge is really being broken.
So let's go back a little bit to the whole process here. And another thing that Andy Haldane was talking about, and as you say, somebody that's maybe going to be the next governor of the Bank of England, but certainly has a lot of authority as the former chief economist there, and he's somebody that people listen to. But he's looking at this circus, this process whereby for weeks and months now, there's been so much speculation about the budget fed by the government itself. As they talk about flying kites, where they release, what they might do, or they roll the pitch, as we've talked about, another phrase, which comes from cricket, I think.
I think the string of the kites has got caught in the handles of the roller.
Yeah,
exactly.
With it. There's been so much going on, yeah. And so they're doing all of this briefing, and we're then hearing what's happening and what's not happening, and ultimately a budget which is supposed to be this decision by government over the finances, is the speculation around it is having an impact on the market. So you've mentioned the bond markets there. So the cost of government debt, in response to Rachel Reeves' U-turning on her tax plans, went up. Stabilised a little bit, I think, today. But ultimately, these things have an impact on the market. And so what Andy Haldane was saying is, you can't have this endless speculation. Either you say nothing, like the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, and you have a regulated way in which information is released at certain times. And we know that the bank does this kind of forward guidance thing as well, by sort of indicating the direction of travel. Or you have a more specific consultation process whereby you discuss options for the budget and have an open and honest conversation about those. What did you make of that argument? Is it possible to do that?
Well, I just think that you've got to... the problem is we've had a culture of lots of like leaking and kite flying. Flight kaying is something totally different. Lots of kite flying where they're almost like trying to put proposals out there to see, do they get a favourable reaction, or how much of a negative reaction do they get, and doing all that. So that's been around for quite a while. But it's just the amount of it, and because we're basically having a 3-month lead-in from to this budget of speculation of taxes, and and essentially I would see this as the Rachel Reeves' tenure so far in number 11 is going to be a case study of how not to do it, how not to act as a chancellor in terms of how you're actually turning into an amplifier of instability, uncertainty, and damaging confidence and ultimately damaging investment. Because when this is all linking in with things like pensions and savings, and people are trying to then anticipate and are acting on speculation, which they did that last year as well, which turns out not to be true, whether it was people with taking out their 25% tax-free lump sum for their pension because they feared there were going to be changes or wealth taxes, and then that's maybe been damaging for individuals, and similarly with businesses as well. It's just turned into noise where it's been kind of Radio Rachel Reeves, just in terms of what tax is going up today, and it's
the speech itself a couple of weeks ago, which now we can totally discount, was this kind of exercise in Kremlinology, as people say, where because she's talking about a budget that she can't specifically talk about any of the measures, she talked in kind of a language would allow you to try and read between the lines. And reading between the lines, the implication was she's going to put up taxes. Income tax is probably going to be put up because she's going to act in the national interest, not just the party political interest. Now we can say all of that, put that in the bin.
Because what the Speaker in the House of Commons has got annoyed in with previous chancellors, and I think from memory Rachel Reeves last year as well, because essentially if there are announcements which are made ahead of the budget, in theory, that's not meant to happen, that it's meant to be, it goes to the House and it should be a statement that the Chancellor is unveiling them. And I think it was there was some, was it a Chancellor or an MP in Clement Attlee's government was then sacked for making some announcement which would be sort of like par for the course now. So I think they need to really start reining it back in and not having all of these leaks and stuff which are damaging confidence. Because imagine if it was the Bank of England where say it's roughly 6 weeks between a monetary policy committee meeting, where then the Bank of England or some MPC members are going over the space of 6 weeks, interest rates are going to be cut. Yes, they're going to be cut. They might be cut by 50 basis points. Oh no, we might actually hold. I think we might need to raise them. And if you were starting to do and playing that sort of game, how damaging, and you just don't do that. So I think they need to go back and be a bit more like the Bank of England, the MPC, and trying to stop the leaks. And it should be, and I would be more for having the one fiscal event per year as well.
So we have the budget and we have the spending review. You bring the
or just have one budget, because they have what the second one is, where they then have it's for forecasting purposes, where the OBR then has to have forecast. So there's then now it's like a spring statement.
Okay,
but over the years, what they've done is they've created them into two meaty kind of almost like budgets, and I think there's been almost like ongoing commentary all the time on the budget and the fiscal forecasts, and that hasn't been helpful for confidence, hasn't been helpful for uncertainty and investment. And they need to, it's kind of like less is more, and whether you just then run with the one event per year and then work with it and then try and do all the other things and policies between it, but don't turn it into a circus and the media event and all the whole speculation, which is just soaking up time and angst, and people aren't actually dealing with the facts of is the actual budget. So just and
as you're saying, it does have real world consequences. I mean, last week's Trading Up, we were talking to Rupert Soames, who's the chair of the CBI. He's run a number of very big companies himself, and essentially he was reasonably complimentary about the government in some respects, in terms of its international policy, in terms of how it's negotiated with Europe and with the US. And, Starmer seems to have done a reasonable job there. But what he was saying in relation to business, and of course the CBI looks after the interests of big business generally. Its members are some of the biggest employers in the UK. And he was saying his message to government was essentially business gave its pound of flesh in the last budget, so you got to leave them be this time. And the other thing he was saying, which I think is kind of part of all of this, is about growth, and that ultimately, if you're going to have a solution to the huge ballooning of the public debt and all of the costs of funding public services, you have to, yes, look at perhaps cut some benefits. You've got to look at maybe cut some public services up to a point. You've got to look at productivity in the public sector, and he was suggesting maybe AI might give us some hope there. But fundamentally what you need is growth in the economy, because it's only with growth, and this was supposed to be Labour's big focus, it's only with growth that you're going to have the revenues coming into government to be able to spend on public services. But growth, we just don't really hear much talk about it again anymore, do we? Nor do we see any realistic policies about driving it.
No, I think we were hearing it sort of before the reset. When was the reset? Was it September?
Yeah.
Reset was then just before Angela Rayner stood down. And, yeah. So we could be due another reset, but it's a fact that you mentioned earlier. Just whenever the Labour government came into power back in 1997, and yes, different circumstances, and they had a long time to plan. But what I was struck for back then, when I just started my career in the civil service and was analysing budgets and things like that, and the Labour government, was they were just rolling out things, whether it was like straight out of the traps. It was they made the Bank of England independent. They were then looking at the national minimum wage as it was then, but it was all steady stream. Here's plans, and they were working the plans and all the kind of Gordon Brown's prudence for a purpose when he was initially being tight with the finances, and then it was going to go on to then when he opened the spigots then in the early noughties and into the health service and things like that. But it was the fact that there was a plan. Similarly, whenever the coalition government came in with Osborne and Cameron and Nick Clegg, in terms of the austerity, whether you liked it or not, there was a clear sense of a plan, and they were working through that. And this Labour government has had significant time to plan for this, in terms of to deal with policies and what they were going to do. And I know it was a bad hand that they were dealt with, but there's a sense of there isn't actually a plan. Mm-hmm. And what we're doing, it's almost like we're, 16 months into this, about 16 months into this current government, and it feels like it's tired and fatigued and running out of ideas, and as if it was a government which is, a year away from an election after it's been in 10 years, kind of thing. It just feels exhausted.
Feeling. Yeah, considering that it is still a young government with a large majority. And
it was Andy Haldian had said today, where he said, yes, it was a bad hand that Rachel Reeves had been dealt, but that she has played it poorly.
Bad hand, played badly. Yeah, not a great showing. Okay, well, I suppose we'll just have to wait and see what comes out of it, and we can have another rattle at it at the end of this month once that's happened.
I think it's going to be in the salary sacrifices. Seems to be that could be the new national insurance part 2.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is the pensions and so on, and
and just salary sacrifice schemes, and we're.
Salary sacrifice schemes is where you've got another benefit in kind and so on.
It can be pensions, so you can have some of your things can be salary sacrifice. Some in terms of pensions, some of them aren't. But whether you then sacrifice some of your salary, and then the employers then they save on the national insurance contributions, because if it's depending on top rate, you'll be talking about 15% employers would be paying on that. So if they save some of that, so there's talk of that's going to be looked at. So it could be a cap of you've like £2,000 per year limit on that for national insurance. So again, while she's not going to touch national insurance contributions, people will pay more national insurance contributions if salary sacrifice is diluted down, and that hits employers a lot higher than employees, just because of the level, the different rates. But that's essentially going to be like another jobs tax.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So which has come back then with Rupert Soames from the CBI telling me leave business alone. He'll not be happy with, or his members wouldn't be happy with that.
Absolutely.
And I suppose just Yeah, before we sort of finally park the budget, just in terms of this smorgasbord approach, and you mentioned wealth taxes, I heard another interesting contribution from Paul Johnson, who used to head up the IFS, and you would know well, and his analysis is always very interesting and understandable and worth listening to. But he was making a good point about the likes of capital gains tax. And so there's an argument to say that you should harmonise the rates of capital gains tax with income tax, because somebody that earns their money from assets that appreciate in value shouldn't have an advantage against somebody who's been paid a wage. But his point was you would need to index link any reform on that tax, because currently it's not. And so therefore, I suppose maybe it's a rule of thumb. So you might be paying, 20% or whatever it is in your capital gains tax. But you'll have seen over the period of 10 or 20 years, whatever it is, that you've been holding those assets at depreciation because of inflation. And so it's not as simple as just harmonising the rates. You then have to build in some sort of index linking. Hi there. I'm just interrupting for a minute to thank you for being part of the Trading Up community. It's really appreciated. I think we're building a real community of business and entrepreneurship learning. So remember to hit follow or subscribe. It makes a big difference. And please drop me an email on tradinguppodcast@gmail.com. And while I have you, just a quick word about our sponsors, EY. EY's technology experts simplify the complex, whether it's AI, cryptocurrencies, or emerging innovations, empowering you to reimagine what's possible and shape the future with confidence. And EY is committed to positively impacting 1 billion lives by 2030. EY helps organisations embed sustainability at the core of their strategy, driving long-term value for business, people, and the planet. That's it for now. Let's get back to the conversation. There was talk before about a wealth tax, but that again seems to have sort of dissipated a little bit, less focus on that. But could we see big reforms on taxes like capital gains, do you think?
I'm not sure whether we'll see much, whether they sort of adjust the rate a bit on that. But yeah, as you say, it's the fact that if you have like a buy-to-let and you've held it for a lengthy period of time, you're not going to get credited for inflation, and then that does seem a bit harsh. But I don't think we'll see any new wealth taxes as such, although apart from on the property side, there's then talk of the council tax, which you have in England and Wales, where it's then, which is kind of broadly equivalent to what we have as rates here, where they're talking about then increasing or having a levy on a proportion of the higher valued homes, and that would be seen as kind of like a wealth tax, which is something that Stormont could do if it so wished. And indeed it's so if what will be interesting to see is if that happens in the budget, then those extra revenues obviously go into the coffers across the water, but nothing happens to Stormont. But they have, because that's devolved, they are perfectly entitled to do that, but hitherto now have not gone there, and they've capped the rates cap for houses at in Northern Ireland at 400,000, and they haven't gone above that.
Yeah, and you were at the Belfast Chamber Economic Conference where the Secretary of State, Hilary Benn, said a few words, and I was interviewing him and was asking him about kind of Stormont's role in all of this with the upcoming budget and Stormont's attitude towards its finances. And indeed, the Finance Minister, John O'Dowd, had been at the same conference where he'd said that his officials were engaged in conversations with the Treasury about seeking greater fiscal autonomy. I think a lot of people in that room from the business community would say, please don't give them any, because hitherto what they have had, they've either haven't used or have suggested they might use it in a way that they weren't happy with. But nor did I detect any great appetite from the Cabinet Minister, Hilary Benn, to be handing over a lot more fiscal power to Stormont, because they aren't doing things like water charges, they aren't addressing issues like that, they aren't making up the shortfall in raising taxes here that would maybe give them a stronger argument with the Treasury. And so there's a sense that as far as Stormont's concerned, the Treasury has sort of given up for now, isn't really engaging on any kind of great scheme with Stormont, because it wants Stormont to kind of sort its own house out first before it starts to maybe look at new schemes or ways of helping Stormont raise more funds to spend locally.
Yeah, and I think this is a challenging period for Stormont going forward, because it was before Labour came into power. I suppose there was a belief then, if the Tories, the kind of evil Tories, are thrown out of power, and then we get then a Labour government, because the devolved government has never been in a position where they've had a Labour government that hasn't got any money. Largely speaking, because initially, whenever it was start of devolution, when it was Brown and Blair, it was like the money was no object, and it was we're getting these real term increases of 3-4% in public expenditure every year during the start of the noughties, and it was fantastic. The problem is that's not the game that we play anymore, that we're playing anymore, and Labour government, while it is more left wing and kind of more socialist and more into public spending than the Conservatives, its fiscal hands are largely tied.
Yeah.
And that, I think it's that recognition of we can't in Northern Ireland keep going over with the kind of begging bowl, and we're a special case and we need more, because there's already been in terms of the needs assessment, where there's been leeway given in terms of getting back to our relative need of the 124% or the 24% above what England gets. That's already been made. But the onus is on us to pull the levers that we have to deliver the things that we need to do. And Westminster, and the Labour government have got a whole host of problems, not least in terms of defence spending, funding it, and all the international issues going on to get their heads around.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, look, we'll of course go back to the budget, very soon, and maybe even once it's out. that'll be something new. Let's actually talk about it once we have it. Looking across the Atlantic, Donald Trump. Is he actually wavering on tariffs? Because inflation was one of the things that got him elected, saying, inflation was terrible, he was going to sort it out. But it hasn't been sorted out. Inflation's pretty much the same level in the States now as it was whenever he came in. And of course, having slapped tariffs on loads of countries, including Brazil, 50% tariff on Brazil. It's not just coffee that Brazil sends to the US. So loads of foodstuffs affected by Trump's tariffs. Isn't helping the broader inflation picture, and cost of living. I think, was it affordability was the term that Mr. Mandami was using in New York, and Zohran Mandami was using the idea of affordability. That's what got him elected, and the Democrats did well in other elections. So I think maybe Trump's starting to realise that affordability is an issue. Tariffs may not help. And is he backing down on some key issues?
He has been backing down on some key issues, because it has been inflation. He has been spared a bit in terms of the fact that the government shutdown was then stopping the statistics. The Bureau of Labour Market Statistics, which produces all the inflation and employment data, hasn't been producing the statistics. So people haven't been getting the official readings, but people have been able to see the price of steak has been one, the cost of beef. When you get that, some of that coming from Brazil with a 50% tariff on, it's not helpful. So what he has been doing, combination of the inflationary pressures that US consumers are feeling, and Donald Trump's poll ratings, which are kind of plunging. On Friday there, he was then actually cutting some tariffs on grocery prices, where he's trying to backtrack. So everything from oranges, tomatoes, bananas, cocoa, coffee, tea and beef. And that's what he's been doing. And then he's been trying to work with his buddy in Argentina, the chainsaw guy, Malay, in terms of getting more beef exports to come from our Argentinian beef exports to go up to the US, but whatever quota he got, it's only going to be 2 days worth in terms of beef. So yes, he is under pressure in that. So he has been sort of backtracking, and I think it's this week we also find out whether the the Supreme Court, how it's going to rule on Trump's tariffs, of whether they're illegal or not.
Yeah, so that one's one to watch. The Supreme Court ruling, could suggest, for instance, that the tariffs are illegal. You can get your ringing phone out of the way there while we're it's probably Andy Haldean, just to say that he's got a few more other pointers, or maybe it's Rachel Reeves to give off what we've been saying about her.
Same initials, but
but yeah, I mean, the thing about Argentina is it's a big country and all the rest of it, but it's a fraction of the size of Brazil in terms of its economy, in terms of its relationship to the States. So there are no easy solutions here. Trump's taken against Brazil because of the political colour of the administration there in Brazil, but it's one of those big trading partners that will have an impact on prices in the States. And so interesting to see how this sort of nervousness towards inflation might feed through on other tariff levels. And as you say, the Supreme Court will rule. Doesn't mean that the tariffs, you might find other ways of imposing them, doesn't mean that they disappear overnight. I see criticism from the Trump administration that Europe hasn't been forthcoming enough in terms of getting the detail done on the deal with the US. But maybe Europe's hanging on a little bit, waiting to see what the Supreme Court does, see if that gives them any more leverage before they tie down a deal. So there's still a lot playing out on the whole tariffs front, which, has an impact here, because you mentioned exports in the PMI survey in Northern Ireland are down. We do have to be cognizant of what's happening with geopolitics, with things like tariffs, because it just has a big impact on global trade overall.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in many ways, I think it's it's almost Trump's tariff announcements. He can't defy economic gravity forever. And I think that's what's happening, in the sense why he's been under pressure to try and roll back or exclude some of the kind of various fruits and beef and coffee, etc., some of the essentials, to then try and get those costs down, because the inflationary pressures are going to have an impact, and we're going to see probably more of that going forward.
Another interesting one caught my eye, and I suppose it's just an interesting little tidbit because what it tells us about our global interconnectedness. And this one's China and Italy. And this is a story I never saw coming. So China has been left with a tomato paste mountain. Now, we used to talk about EU kind of food mountains, but this isn't China. And it's a tomato paste mountain because sales to Italy have collapsed. What's going on there?
Yeah, so what has been happening has been that China has been able to undercut the cost of tomato paste. I think it's about less than half of the equivalent in Italy. So we were then seeing imports, and where China produces this tomato paste is in the Xinjiang province, and there have been complaints about alleged use of forced labour with the Muslim Uyghur community, and this has then kind of hit the Italian public. And then it was because some Italian brands were then using this cheaper version and failing to reveal on their labelling where the kind of origin is, and there's been a real backlash on that.
I can imagine, yeah. I mean, like I've my sister lives in Rome. I've got an Italian brother-in-law, and we've seen what happens whenever, I don't know, Jamie Oliver puts cream into tagliatelle or whatever, carbonara, when it's not supposed to have cream, and the Italians go mad, or somebody puts the wrong thing into tiramisu. So the Italians themselves were eating Chinese tomato paste. I mean, that's hard to believe. So there would have been riots, presumably, when they found out about this.
And it's actually, so the US has banned this tomato paste made in Xinjiang since 2021 because of the alleged use of forced labour and all of that sort of stuff. So, but it's what are they going to do with this big tomato mountain? And made me think of there's an annual food fight festival in Valencia called Tomatina,
right?
Which is held on the last Wednesday of August, where everybody just goes mad. And so whether we're going to see something like that happening in Xinjiang anytime soon.
And I mean, talking about the Chinese, the global politics is still interesting because a lot of competition, although the US and China have sort of settled their differences, they've called a truce, shall we call it, the trade war for the next year or so on tariffs. But that doesn't mean that there isn't still this intense competition and concern about China jumping ahead of the US in key economic sectors. And the US very keen to protect those that it feels it still has, such as AI and the chips and so on, the important semiconductors. But here, we talked about this, I suppose, a few weeks ago. We were talking about the gold mine in Tyrone and the delay in approving that mine. Now, that's an American company that has invested $250 million so far, hasn't got planning permission, hasn't had an answer, been waiting 8 years. I understand that the US Trump administration, if you like, the government have been following this and aren't too pleased with Stormont's kind of delay on that. And indeed, they're also a little bit nervous about the, shall we say, friendly relations between Stormont and the Chinese government here in Northern Ireland. And we know that the Chinese have a big presence, a big diplomatic presence here in Belfast. So it's interesting to see that this kind of geopolitics again playing out here in Belfast in the relationships between the US, the Chinese and the Stormont government.
Yeah. So I was actually at an event last week where it was the Chinese consulate here in Northern Ireland and Belfast was then celebrating its 10th anniversary, and there was a big event there, and the local politicians at it as well. It was actually on Remembrance Day, and it was the fact that there was then mention of then the Chinese and the people. I think it was over I can't remember the figures in terms of the kind of death toll from the Japanese in World War II, which we kind of forget about. But we've seen those tensions between China and Japan then even over the weekend have started to sort of kick off again. But so it's it just shows how geopolitics is going to become, because while China has then become, obviously for the last 10 years, it's now established a presence here and is interested in building up trade and investment links. That is in with the new, as it were, in terms of geopolitics, and whereas the US is the incumbent, and how feathers get ruffled on that front.
Yeah, and interesting that given the nature of the US administration at the moment, previous US administrations, very much going back to Clinton, of course, seen as sort of midwives to the whole peace process, and then the economic growth to flow from that. And indeed, the first thing that Clinton did was an economic conference, to sort of signal the US kind of buying into this peace process in Northern Ireland. And maybe something that the Trump administration is a little bit less concerned about, hasn't really looked towards Northern Ireland, hasn't talked about it much. But it's just interesting that, still not ignoring what's going on in Northern Ireland, because, what these regional governments do with things like the Chinese government, if the US administration sees that as competition in this big battle for economic supremacy, if you like, going into the next decade, then they're going to let people know about it if they think that.
Because it's even you take then Ireland as a whole is always viewed to be, or likes to view itself as everybody's friend. Mm-hmm. But in terms of geopolitics, whose friend, that becomes a bit more of a diplomatic tightrope that you're kind of walking, particularly in terms of with China and US, and does the US see you too friendly to China, and potentially vice versa? Yeah,
and we're seeing pieces like in the Wall Street Journal recently from senior former Trump administration officials criticising Ireland's outlook politically. Now, it's one thing for Ireland's perfectly entitled to have its own political outlook, but it's interesting that in a sense, that's never been an issue. Nobody's really kind of worried about what Ireland thinks about geopolitics, because it can do its own thing, and it has a low tax base and lots of American companies here. All of that was all good, and everybody kind of didn't bother themselves with it. But now suddenly you have an administration that doesn't like the idea of US companies investing overly too much abroad or putting their profits abroad, doesn't like the idea of countries that criticise its political outlook, and Ireland would be seen to be, on the left on a lot of issues, particularly in terms of the Middle East, etc. Also neutral, but not even the fact that it's neutrality, but the fact that it doesn't spend much at all on defence. And we've seen what Trump has said in relation to Europe's need to spend on defence. So all of these things are big negatives for Ireland as it tries to negotiate its ongoing sort of economic relationship with the US. And if something dramatic happens there, that could be a big threat to Ireland's economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it's even in terms of the neutrality issue could then become more of an issue then even within Europe as well, as as Poland, Germany, France and all, they're all kind of like ramping up, and then they're kind of spending in the face of the threat from Russia. And if then Ireland, which is the most prosperous, one of the most prosperous, it's got budget surplus, is then, I think it's spending about 0.5% of GDP on sort of its defence, is then seen to be then basically free riding on the what they call the defence umbrella of Europe now, the EU, and also in terms of NATO, without stumping up the appropriate sort of cash. So I could see that's just going to be something going forward that is going to be the Irish government is going to be in the back foot trying to probably appease the pressure that is put on it. Yeah,
as you're right, and the pressure may come not just from the US but also from the rest of Europe if it's spending, like Poland, what is 10 times that amount it spends per capita GDP on defence. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting.
And ultimately, whenever you think of all the kind of the cables, the telecoms cables, which are off the coast of Ireland, which then serve Europe, UK, etc., a lot of the protection of that has been done by UK, Royal Navy, but if those cables were cut, Ireland is going to suffer like the rest of people's stuff. So that's the kind of new, the kind of grey. They talk about the kind of grey zone of the kind of wars that we're facing at the minute.
Yeah. Okay. Well. Definitely another one to keep an eye on, and of course it all has economic impacts as to what what Ireland's, if you like, defence spending or policy has an impact beyond just the defence industries itself. So we'll leave it there for this week. Listen, thanks a million for joining us on Trading Up Unpacked, covering the bases from, local jobs figures through to geopolitics and what's happening with tomato paste in China and in Italy. Thanks a million, Richard. Thanks for joining us. Join us again next time.